According to Google, being stupid means showing a great lack of intelligence or common sense. Daniel Dubois is no stranger to this term.
What happened in the sparring?
This guy is so stupid. He mentioned the sparring where he got beaten up. So why mention this?
Whether it be comparisons to Lenny from Of Mice and Men or comedic press conference clips.
You know what I mean, Dan? Sorry? That's it.
Dubois can seem a bit stupid. I'd argue, although not the brightest, chronic shyness and the inability to read social situations worsens the depiction of him being simple and slow. But this got me thinking, is being conventionally dense and dull actually a positive attribute in boxing? Does it make a fighter resistant to immense pressure? Do the fans prefer simple boxers smashing lumps out of each other? Let's find examples of pugilists who utilised a lack of brains to excel in the sweet science. But first, a bit of history. The early bare-knuckle era favoured tough but often simple fighters. Boxers would stand before one another, trading ferociously with little skill or footwork to show for it. But then came this man. Daniel Mendoza, the father of scientific boxing, promoted footwork, the jab and defence, breeding generations of boxing thinkers. A fighter's ring IQ could now carry them to victory as opposed to just brute strength or resilience. The Victorians saw boxing as an art form, arguing if people wanted to hurt each other, they resort to weapons first before considering a clenched fist. Practitioners were often rich, learned men, deeming themselves as smart pioneers, with contemporary writer Bohan Lynch citing the real cleverness and brainwork required. But the prize money for fighting in Britain was far lower than that in the US in the early 1900s. For affluent Brits, it was a hobby. For poor Americans, it was a means of escaping poverty. The legendary Jack Dempsey fell into this category. Although far from stupid, immense poverty meant he dropped out of elementary school to work and left home at age 16, scuppering any formal education. He instead made money through challenging people to fight outside saloons as a teenager. This tough upbringing and consequent aggressive fighting style bolstered his popularity with American audiences. Although not stupid, he was certainly simple when compared to Tunney. See, Heavyweight Tunney was a bookworm who lectured on Shakespeare at Yale and formed friendships with playwrights like George Bernard Shaw. He would use long complex words in interviews and would frequently have books in hand after training. But, as Ben notes, the boxing fraternity were highly suspicious of him, instead wishing their boxers simple and homespun. Dempsey took advantage of this suspicion, vowing to knock the big bookworm out in 8 before their second fight in 1927. Dempsey is one of the best remembered pugilists of all time, while Tunney is effectively unknown outside of hardcore circles, so the popularity factor driven partly by Dempsey's simplicity ensured greater legacy despite equally impressive records. But the UK showed a similar disposition towards so-called stupid fighters. Most notable was the dichotomy between a sophisticated Chris Eubank Sr. and a brash brute in Nigel Benn. Of course, Nigel was not stupid per se, but his notorious spending sprees after wins and rough demeanour had journalists labelling him as base and vulgar, often deemed an ex-soldier who just wanted to destroy, with any other thought absent.
All right, gentlemen, you both signed the contract.
I personally do hate him.
So is there any point in me asking you to shake hands after signing the contract?
No.
Well, gentlemen, all four of you, thanks for joining us tonight.
In my personal opinion, he was craftier and more complex than many realise, but his bluntness led to some drawing conclusions of him lacking intellect.
I didn't mean to insult you, I'm sorry.
No,
honestly, genuinely, I wasn't trying to insult you.
Don't disrespect me, mate.
No, I'm not trying to, I'm not in any sense. Why would you take umbrage at a valid question?
No.
Chris Eubank, however, was ostentatiously smart, and he knew it, belittling Benn as wild and lacking class. But, like in the US, the British populace were wary of this pompous man describing himself as a demigod. While he lectured philosophy at UCL and openly criticised boxing as a mugs game, it bred public resentment, and Benn took full advantage. As The Guardian's Donald McRae noted, Eubank knew his limitations as a fighter, instead meticulously selecting substandard opponents and avoiding overly dangerous names like James Tunney and Michael Nunn. His fights were often tedious and dull, with Eubank strutting around the ring and taking very few risks, as evidenced by his controversial wins against Dan Schommer and Ray Close. By being smart through cherry-picking opponents and preserving his WBO super middle title, he alienated much of the fans and dampened his own legacy. Benn, on the other hand, was less calculated in his approach, opening himself to substantial risk and electing to fight dangerous opponents.
All this, the Queensbury rules, whatever they call it. You got to go in and you got to go in and hurt someone.
I'd argue this rash approach paid dividends, with Benn beating renowned American stars like Doug DeWitt, Iran Barkley and Gerald McClellan, therefore drawing greater support than Eubank and cementing his legacy. So Benn's simplicity actually benefited his career.
Why are you all looking so scared? Act like you're going to funeral. I'm the one fighting. When you get out here, if you're afraid, just smile. Just act like you're happy. I'm not gonna win the fight if I went out thinking like you. Damn George Fool.
Although a dramatisation, this scene encompasses the concept of nerves and fear prior to major fights. Let's face it, unlike other sports, you don't play boxing, and through making yourself vulnerable to a brutal beating or an untimely death, fighters can become incredibly anxious. But are analytical boxers more prone to this fear, with their minds likely worrying over potential consequences and outcomes? Returning to Gene Tunney, a radio talk from December 1927 saw him state, "A man with imagination is unusually nervous at so important an event as a championship match, for he will permit his imagination to travel and dwell on what is apt to happen and its results." In comparison to heavyweight Tony Galante, labelled as an archetypal ignorant pug by Deers after believing William Shakespeare was a foreign heavyweight, you can start to build up a picture. Boxers like Galanto would enter bouts with little thought in their mind, solely hell-bent upon dismantling opponents. Visiting boxing forums, questions remain over Joe Louis's intelligence, with many suggesting he lacked brains entirely. This is harsh. In fact, Margalik's Beyond Glory clarifies Joe's haphazard attendance of primitive schools, speech impediment, and him having few deep feelings of his own. Importantly, he notes the gargantuan hopes people placed on his shoulders, enough to crush normal people, appeared to impose no burden on Joe at all. He was not stupid, just simple, methodical, and utterly focused on the craft. In possibly the most highly pressurized bout in history, with Joe Louis representing the democratic free world and Max Schmeling championing the authoritarian Nazi cause, the stakes were so high. Adding to the gravity, Joe had been embarrassed by the German in front of a home crowd just 2 years prior in June 1936. The 1938 rematch lasted just 2 minutes and 4 seconds, with Joe bludgeoning Max from pillar to post. He showed no signs of feeling pressure, despite hundreds of millions praying for the American to dispel the Aryan myth of supremacy. So a simple demeanour can likely offset the monumental pressure that comes with historic boxing matchups. In AJ Liebling's renowned The Sweet Science, Welsh heavyweight Tommy Farr's father is labelled as a very aggressive caveman-like fighter. Prehistoric cavemen have connotations of being quite dull and mentally simple, but this notion brings me onto a further element perhaps ingrained in so-called stupid boxers, namely killer instinct. Do introspective smart fighters struggle to finish off opponents, failing to rid themselves of nagging empathy? In the case of Daniel Dubois, he has evidently shown extensive aggression in his recent fights with Jarrell Miller, Filip Hrgovic and of course Anthony Joshua. He's demonstrated a knack for smelling blood and pressing hard to ensure the victory is secured, which isn't a trait all top boxers necessarily possess. Gene Tunney was consistently hounded by boxing writers as lacking killer instinct, and there is evidence to show this. In his autobiography, Tunney stated that he found no joy in knocking people unconscious, and that the lust for battle and massacre was missing. He seemed to feel compassion for fellow pugilists, not really wanting to inflict pain. Jack Dempsey, however, sought to spark out competition whenever possible. Accidents within the ring can erode a killer instinct, with fighters' thoughts eating them alive in the years following. The complex, philosophical Chris Eubank Sr., after putting Michael Watson in a coma in 1991, desperately grappled with the reality of the pain and suffering he had inflicted. Despite fighting on, there's a consensus that Eubank's fire was never truly the same, with Deers suggesting deep down that Eubank was worried the same fate may befall him. This sadness would plague him till this very day.
I can't tell you how sorry.
With those of higher IQs being at risk of developing psychological disorders, leading to depression on occasion, being smarter likely contributes to heightened feeling in a sport where it's often better to halt any sentimentality. So perhaps, a fighter with a more active mind is more prone to losing this killer instinct when confronted by a traumatic and troublesome event. This is of course speculative, but there could be credibility in it, especially in a lonely sport like boxing where, for major periods, it really is just you and your thoughts. So to conclude, I've made this video to explore the idea of dumber fighters garnering an advantage in multiple ways. But basically, I've hardly scratched the surface, so let's open the discussion up to you guys. What do you think of this whole idea? Are there any particularly simple fighters that come to mind, and did it serve them well in their careers? I'm very keen to hear your thoughts on this. Also, please drop your predictions for the Dubois against Parker fight below. I really don't think it's a foregone conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Please consider liking and subscribing, it genuinely means the most. More content will be on its way, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, that's pretty much everything. Thank you, and see you next time. Cheers.